Queer equality is the conversation this evening. Queer equality. Has the Constitution fulfilled its promise of dignity for all? And we're going to have a conversation in the broader sense and context of minorities, minority communities, minority voices, those on the margins of society, and how continuously we have an obligation, constitutional obligation even, to make them, as everybody else is and should be, in the mainstream, so that we don't have a conversation of majority and minority. There shall just be people. Don't you just remember those eminent words from Bantu Biko, where he said, I wish to live in a society where there is no majority, where there is no minority, there are just people.
So I want to start off by saying that Monday, the 17th of May, was the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia. And of course, this is an annual global commemoration. I was shocked, in fact, to check this week and to discover that the day was chosen because it was the day in 1990 that the World Health Organization declassified us, me and Neo and the other self-identifying queers on this panel, and fortunately the queer allies on this panel are not so classified. We were no longer classified as having a mental disorder. That astounded me. But I also want to say very briefly, Songezo, that our promise of equality in the Constitution came from 3 historical sources. I'm going to give a very quick overview. The first is Simon Kordi, who was arrested in September 1984 for the massive uprising against apartheid in the Vaal townships. He was imprisoned. I met him when he was an awaiting trial prisoner in Pretoria, and he did the astounding thing, not only of coming out to his fellow treason trialists. He was accused number 13 on trial for treason and murder, but he actually, when they rejected him as a homosexual man, he challenged them and he forced them to accept him. That extraordinary act of sustained activist courage laid the basis for the next 2 events. The next was what I like to call, with their permission, and I hope it remains permissive, the Dykes of Cape Town, Sheila Lipinski and others, who had been, the moment it became possible to negotiate in South Africa in 1990, the Cape Town queers and Dykes insisted on including sexual orientation in the Constitution. And the third fact is the receptivity within the ANC. LB, please give a wave. LB Sachs, Arthur Chasselson, George Bezos, and the other members of the ANC's Equality Committee. Those 3 things you can see were pivotal. And when I say that these were the pivotal things to our Constitution, I don't exclude the men in suits, the white men in suits, myself and Kevin Botha, who made submissions to the constitutional process at Kempton Park. But those were the 3 foundational historical moments. And I'm very glad, Neo, that you mentioned blackness and queerness, because Simon's stand and the stands of other black queers in Africa, like Frank Mugisha in Uganda, are absolutely pivotal to all of our liberation.
And when we think about queer history and who shakes the various systems of society, it's not the normative looking person. It is the one that is putting their bodies in the front line of disidentifying with normativity. And when we disidentify with normativity, we then become the gaze of public violence. And in that disidentification, we are also reclaiming who we are as trans identities. So I think there's a massive amount of, I think, almost a reconciliatory process and a healing process within the LGBTI community now to look back at the people who were equally harmed and excluded from within the movement because they were never conforming to a normativity that the Constitution would have wanted. You know, the couples, the normative couples, the couples that would emulate heterosexual families. And if we were all just emulating heterosexual families, society would accept us. And we know that that stereotypical arguments has never won any gains for anybody. And in fact, now we are really sitting at the nexus of looking at what it means to be in our bodies when we are being killed and murdered at the rate at which we are, despite constitutional frameworks and legal frameworks. And we celebrate those legal frameworks because they're strong and they're needed and they're pillars, but they are absolutely meaningful in the when we just continue to litigate and shame the state that is currently intellectually has a deficit intellectually as well as financially. So we're really sitting in this moment of what does it mean when we look at history? Should we look at what's missing in that history? Because should we stop believing that we had a victory? Because I think we need to stop believing that we had a complete victory. I think just the overcoming of apartheid itself was an immense victory. But I want to speak about gender identity, and having grown up and born in 1971, you're born in a colored body where you cannot go to so many places, no beaches, spaces, designated for white people. And in my transition, you equally deal with an unacceptability in law that your body is not acceptable, that your body legally continues to remain violated by the state, by various systems. And we're really sitting in that moment where we have a celebratory framework that is an empty shell in gains. And we have fought everything that we could in relation to establishing the values of normative families. And I think that's a great victory to be had.
Like Edwin, when I was at university or growing up as a teenager, the idea of actually telling somebody that you're attracted to another man was preposterous. It's like saying I'm a mass murderer. It wasn't conceivable. So when the Constitution was adopted, and it was a kind of affirmation that for me already, I'm white privileged, but I think for most people who were queer or queer, it was a magnificent moment. And it was also that time when we were all shouting the Rainbow Nation kind of slogans. So much so that I remember about a year after the Constitution was adopted, I was in Cape Town outside a gay club, having an intense smooching match with another guy called Bongani. And then the police came. It was still those yellow police vans from the apartheid era, and a white Afrikaans policeman got out of the car and he said, "What is the trouble here?" And this is now in the spirit of 1994 and Section 9.3. I turned to him, maybe also the spirit of other things. I turned to him and said, "Well, we are kissing. This is New South Africa. The Constitution protects us. Go away and catch the criminals." Which I could do, maybe because I'm Afrikaans, I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm in the middle of Cape Town. And for quite several years, I thought that is actually really the reality. And then, of course, one realizes that rights are complicated because the rights are not enjoyed by everyone in exactly the same way. And individual, the protection of one part of your life does not necessarily mean without other parts of your life being protected, makes you less capable of enjoying the benefits that I have now described. So if you, your race, your gender, whether you gender conforming or not, whether you're staying in a rural or an urban area, whether you live in a conservative community, all of those things contribute to to what extent you can actually taste the fruits of this product of freedom. That, for me, is a kind of lesson that one cannot really divorce all of these things, whether it's the right to education, whether it's a right to dignity and freedom of expression, and the right to housing and healthcare, all of those things. Without them, the part of you that is also gay or trans or lesbian or queer, whatever you want to call it, is not going to be able to flourish in on an equal footing.
So, can I say that I was quite thrilled and a bit scared when I heard Jabulani and then Pierre, because I thought they were going to have a fight. Jabulani spoke about the emptiness of legal promises, and Pierre spoke about their liberating importance. But in the end, they said the same thing, which is that law is necessary but not sufficient. They both put it that way. We've got to go much, much further. Law is a necessary beginning. And of course, to get there, you've asked exactly the right question, Songeza. We need to consider from our history and from the rest of Africa the courage of people taking the stand. I think that queer visibility is absolutely indispensable. Jabulani, trans visibility. I mean, I confess about my own ignorance and stupidity on matters of trans within the movement. So the visibility of trans people, many of whom are listening, has been important in my own deepening understanding and humiliating me about my ignorance. Secondly, courage and solidarity and organizational activism on the part of queer people and their allies. So, Songeza, that's a long answer to your question, but I want to place us in our location as Africans. We face an African crisis of homophobia.
How do we move as a people, as an African people, to recognize our diversity being a strength, to recognize the fact that far too many people still do not enjoy their bodies? How else then can they enjoy their communities, their resources, their environment at large?
We have to claim our own entitlement to queerness, Songeza. That's the answer. You say, how do we make other people tolerant? Your fellow employees, your family, come out to your best friend, come out to your closest circle. You don't have to come out in the Sunday newspapers or on a platform, but claim your identity. That is the start of insight and consciousness, and it leads to an acceptance in a greater political, structured, organizational sense as well.
But there are two other, and Sheila Lipinski also played a very big role in ALGA. She cornered me as soon as I came back from exile. And they asked me from ALGA, Comrade Albie, what would you say our strategy should be in using the law? And I said, my suggestion is, don't start with gay marriage, same-sex marriage, end with that. Start with decriminalization. That's the most vicious public form of, brutal form of oppression. And you'll get wide public support for that. Move then to equality, non-discrimination in work and in general rights, and end up with same-sex marriages. And that was the sequence that was pursued. So very surprising support. But the support was based on deep principle from people in the hetero world who felt it's our dignity that's assailed. When our fellow human beings are being assailed for being who they are being not allowed to live as full human beings, it's our dignity that's also being affected. And the country we were fighting for, the free South Africa, was a South Africa where people could be who they were.
I think the question is twofold, because the one is when we became a democracy, I remember going across the country with so many other organizations teaching communities about how to vote, what does the democracy mean, what is the constitution. And I think there's a huge regression in constitutional literacy across the country that in fact, not only within relation to LGBTI rights, but generally the majority of people in this country are persistently face abuse because, one, constitutional literacy and knowing our rights is just absent, and knowing where to go. And I think the issue about rights almost feel privileged or elite versus that they actually should be embodied and embedded in our daily practice, in our daily work, our daily lives. So I think this is a massive challenge.
There was a time when some of us at least, almost were too, believing too much that the Constitution and just adopting laws are going to actually profoundly and immediately change things. And that is not how systemic oppression works. And so while as I agree with everybody else, we've all said it, that it is so important that we have the Constitution, that the laws have been changed. But now the question is, what do we do now? And it's a challenge because I think one of the things that everybody has also said, but how to do it is very difficult, is how do you build solidarity between people who are oppressed in many different ways, and it lands differently for different people who are differently situated. Because for me, I think the problem with the Constitution is not that it hasn't given everything that it promised, because in retrospect, that was not going to happen. It's not possible for the law to do that.
What the discussion today has illuminated is a huge victory was won in terms of the massive historical discrimination against gays and lesbians at that time. And even the Unity Equality Group was gay and lesbian equality. And that was important for humanity, for South Africa. What's become clear is those categories are too broad. There are people who are different in terms of their sexuality, the sexual orientation, and even biologically and spiritually and personally. And it's people like Jabulani who are putting the issue on the agenda and speaking beautifully with so much thought. It's raised the issues to a new kind of a level that struck me immediately now as being very, very protective of the right of people to be who they are.
It's the sickness in a way that is at the heart of the South African society, is inequality that is material inequality, but also inequality of status because of homophobia, racism, sexism, and the like. And it's difficult. They are moving parts. They're all linked up to one another. And if it is correct that as Edwin said, and I think it is, that actually connecting with other people is a powerful personal way of doing a kind of politics, of coming out, of connecting with people. One of the problems we have in South Africa, but maybe I'm saying that because I'm sitting in Cape Town, one of the things we have here, as many other cities, is the city is economically, racially, completely and spatially segregated because it's apartheid segregation. So even if inequality is somehow reduced, the spatial segregation remains. So there are so many different things. So in a way, I'm saying if you are for queer rights, you must be for spatial justice. If you are fighting against racial discrimination, you must be against queer rights, because these things are all linked.
Classifications must fit people. I want a t-shirt that says that, because I think it's so much about self-determination and where we are. And I think as a continent and as a country, we are really still undoing so many things that colonialism brought to us, that apartheid brought to us. We undoing and we undoing consistently. And I think the one thing that we have to strengthen as a society is to really think about mutual aid and mutual cooperation. That it's not just my loaf of bread, it's about sharing. It's about how do we reach out to each other in different ways. How do we celebrate pride across various communities in our society, and I think the resilience, we don't celebrate that too much, because in our traumatized bodies we are focused so much on trauma and pain. But there is so much resilience, there is so much that about not giving up, about change, about really working and ensuring that the constitution we have becomes that reality, that we can live in dignity and in freedom with mutual respect.